So this talks about what is radioactive waste management, what is disposal. It's the where and what, something about the principles of disposal, and that's the kind of preamble. It takes up about a third of the talk. And then the rest of it, I'm really talking about UK radioactive waste management policy, how it's been implemented from the 1950s up to the present day. And it's a look of what went right and mostly what went wrong to try to seek out the important lessons. And then I finish up with an examination of what's going on at the moment. We're getting to a very interesting phase right now. And that takes up about 2/3 of the talk. So without any further ado, we'll start with where it is, what it is. Where does it come from? Well, one way and another, mainly from nuclear power, partly from the operations that take place at nuclear power stations, but mostly from nuclear fuel, and in particular from reprocessing, which extracts uranium and plutonium from the fuel, and at the same time presents you with a very wide assortment of long-lived wastes, which turn out to be quite difficult to manage. And then representing decommissioning in the bottom right-hand corner, we have Berkeley Power Station. That was 1990. It also comes from nuclear research, and here we see 3 UK research reactors all closed down now. In fact, the IAEA lists 40 UK research reactors, all of them decommissioned, or at least in some stage of decommissioning. And here we see the Windscale, bottom left, Windscale Advanced Gas Reactor, top right, the Dounreay prototype fast reactor. In the far distance, the ball there, that's the Dounreay fast reactor, and that was still working when this photograph was taken in 1976. What you can see is that I was there at the time. What you can see is that these are all large structures, and although all the fuel will have been removed, and with it most of the radioactivity, when you come to decommissioning, there'll still be decontaminated structures and other radioactive material. So decommissioning isn't simply a matter of demolition. And then we go on to other sources. We have nuclear propulsion submarines, nuclear weapons manufacture, isotope manufacture, and seal sources used in medicine, industry, research, and so on. And not only do these sources help us cure and detect cancers and the like, but they're also absolutely essential to safety. So you wouldn't want to get on an airplane where the undercarriage hadn't been examined for flaws by X-rays. So that gives you a kind of spread of the kind of waste that there are. These wastes, these other sources, they're a small fraction of the overall inventory, but they do contain some waste that are quite difficult to deal with. As for the where, there are 37 sites in total, ranging throughout the whole of Great Britain, from Dounreay in the north down to a spray of sites on the south coast. Northern Ireland is not shown as holding any radioactive waste at all. That's not to say that they don't use radioactive material, they certainly do. But when they've done with it, they export it, normally send it back to England for somebody else to deal with. As for what this waste is, well, this diagram tries to give you some idea of waste volumes and waste activity. And it's all drawn roughly to scale, with volumes shown on the left-hand side and activities in terabecquerels. That's tera is a million, 10 to the 12 becquerels, and a becquerel is 1 disintegration per second, so it's a tiny, tiny unit. And what you see is that the high-level waste, this is the heat-generating waste that comes essentially from nuclear fuel, that represents a tiny fraction of the overall volume. But when you look to the right, it represents the majority of it in terms of activity. And similarly, the other extreme, you have low-level and very low-level waste, where you've got 4 million cubic meters of the stuff, but it only represents 100 terabecquerels. It's quite a small amount of reactivity compared to the total. So high-level waste is defined by its heat generation. If it's heat generating significantly, then it's termed high-level waste. Low-level waste is defined in terms of activity, specific activity, so many becquerels per kilogram. And anything that doesn't fit either of those two goes into the middle set. That's intermediate level waste. So it's defined by default. It's neither low level nor high level. And it's shown in this browny yellow color. I see it here. And this comes from various places, comes from reactor operations, but by far the majority comes from the reprocessing of spent fuel. And like high-level waste, it will need to go for deep disposal because of the long-lived waste that are in there. And despite its lower activity, it's widely acknowledged in the business that it is actually the most difficult type of waste to deal with. Omitted from the diagram here is spent nuclear fuel. If we were to include spent nuclear fuel, then it would go into the highest category, high-level waste, and it would increase it by about an order of magnitude in terms of volume, but in terms of activity, it would only be about a factor of 3. And then I should say a word about very low level and low level waste. These are wastes which are sufficiently short-lived. That means that their radioactivity decays away more or less on a human time scale. And they can be disposed to the near surface. And we'll talk some more about that later on. So disposal is defined as, by IAA, emplacement of waste in an appropriate facility without the intention of retrieval. And that distinguishes it very sharply from storage, where the intention is always to retrieve. People sometimes talk about temporary storage, but I would say storage is never permanent, so the word temporary is redundant in fact. And a quick word about disposal safety. This document here that you see in front of you is the IAA document that lays down the safety requirements. And if I were to try to sum up this document in a pithy phrase, I would say that the aim is for passive safety forever. So that's permanent safety without the need for humans to intervene. And the principle that lies behind this is what's called intergenerational equity. The idea that it would be wrong to pass this burden on to future generations who, for all we know, 1,000 years in the future, they may have neither the money nor the expertise to manage it. And this aim is achieved by isolating the waste at depth and containing the radionuclides to the extent that any release has no impact on human health or the environment. And one can only do this because by the very nature of radioactivity, radionuclides will eventually decay to harmless or at least less harmful daughters. So that as time passes, the waste becomes less and less dangerous. And if you compare that, say, with mercury, well, the toxicity of mercury never gets any less. It always stays the same. As for the very long-lived radionuclides, the argument is usually put forward that while these only decay on geological timescales, after 100,000 years or so, the level of activity will be broadly similar to that which was present in the original ore. So you're kind of restoring it to the ground whence it came. Oh dear, I pressed the wrong button, I think. I don't know what's happened here. Share screen. This never happened to me before. Oh, there we are. I seem to have somehow stopped the sharing. I don't know how I managed that. But we'll soon get back to where we were. Okay. So, yeah, there we are. Okay. So I like this cartoon overlooking the slightly nerdy point that the radiation trefoil is upside down. We'll overlook that. The joke plays on this issue of intergenerational equity and tells us why long-term storage is not and never can be the answer. Like a good cook, your nuclear engineer has to clear up as he goes. So before we start talking about policy, I'd just say a little bit of a word about how disposal is implemented. This is a typical near-surface disposal, which is used for short-lived waste. Essentially, short-lived in this business is defined as a half-life of 30 years. So after 1,000 years, after 300 years, 10 half-lives, the activity will have declined by 1,000 times. So essentially, your waste is put into drums of some sort. In the middle, these black things. You might backfill the waste within the drums, probably. You would backfill the waste within the drums with concrete, possibly. Then you might cover the thing with concrete. It's placed in a concrete vault. And then you overfill, you cap the whole thing with compacted clay. And the whole idea is that the clay prevents water, rainwater from permeating through to the waste, so that the main vector for radionuclide movement is water. So if you can prevent water getting to these wastes, the radionuclides will just stay there. And essentially, you can design one of these things to last for quite a long time, for a few hundred years. And that is enough to make sure that most of the radioactivity decays in situ, never goes anywhere else. And then once you're beyond that kind of 300-year timescale, someone can basically dig into this and eat the stuff, and they're not going to be killed by it. And this is the United Kingdom low-level waste repository located near Sellafield. And you can see the metal containers there, these boxes. They're just transport containers, half-height ISO containers, red oxide painted, filled with concrete. And eventually the whole, in fact, it's nearly done now, the whole of this area will be covered in these blocks. And then you'll put a big clay cap over the top and various impermeable barriers in there to seal out the water. And then we come to a kind of schematic for deep disposal. So this is now for long-lived and very long-lived wastes. This tries to give you the general idea. Water is the most important vector for mobilization of radioactivity, radionuclides. And one of the aims of deep disposal is to put it in a location where groundwater movement does not bring the radionuclides quickly back to the surface. So by going deep, we have a much better prospect of finding such a groundwater regime. Putting it at depth also isolates it from human interference. So typically 500 meters is thought to be sufficient. You probably get down to, it's possible to get down to areas at 500 meters where the groundwater there has been in place for millions of years. So the idea is it's not going to go anywhere very quickly in the future. And for the UK waste, a deep geological repository footprint would be of the order of 10 square kilometers. So you can see that this diagram's got quite different scales in the vertical and horizontal directions. We'll see some more about that later. Oh, in fact, here it is, I forgot. This is an illustration from Radioactive Waste Management Limited, our national waste management agency, as to what such a repository would look like. And the total area occupied is about 10 square kilometers here. And at the right-hand end, we have the vaults for low heat generating waste. So these are reprocessing waste that come essentially from Sellafield. And here the waste packages are packed close together, so as they were in the near surface facility. And on the left-hand side, we have tunnels holding the heat generating waste. So these will be vitrified high-level waste and spent fuel. And here the waste packages have to be spaced meters apart so as to reduce the heat loading. You don't want this to get too hot because that would break down the barriers. And as a result, although the heat generating waste occupy most of the footprint, even though its volume is only 2% of the total. So this area represents 98% of the waste volume. This area here represents only 2% of the waste volume. And that's because this heat generating waste has to be spaced out to prevent the temperatures from getting too high. Okay, so we finished with the background. We're on to the main thrust of the talk. And you might wonder why I put this picture of a snake and ladders game at the back as a backdrop for this slide. Well, it's simply that I can think of no better metaphor for the way that the search for a solution to the right of ways problem has been implemented in the UK. And you might see the various policy initiatives, the various acts and policies of the ladders on the board, and then the snakes come in when these policies run into the sand. And from the 1950s through to the later 70s, radioactive waste disposal practice and policy mostly consisted of sea dumping, of low-level waste and short-lived waste. And then since 1959, near-surface disposal of low-level waste at Drigg, now rebadged as the low-level waste repository. And then there were trenches and a shaft for low-level waste at Dounreay. And there was no policy for long-lived or high-level waste. It was all stored. And then in 1976 came the report into nuclear power of the Royal Commission on the Environment, chaired by Sir Brian Flowers, the Flowers Report. And this considered all aspects of nuclear power: reactor safety and siting, safeguarding of plutonium, radioactive waste management. Most famously, it expressed disquiet over radioactive waste management, concluding there should be no commitment to a large program of nuclear fission power until it has been demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that a method exists to ensure the safe containment of long-lived, highly radioactive waste for the indefinite future. In fact, within the body of the report, it's even stronger wording than that, saying in fact that to embark on a large nuclear power program without some prospect of safe disposal would be immoral. So critical though the report may have been, it does constitute our first ladder because it marks a crossroads where principle as opposed to expediency comes to the fore. One might say it's the point at which radioactive waste management begins to be taken seriously. So, amongst the repercussions of the Flowers report were the so-called high-level waste program, intended to explore the science underlying deep disposal with an eye to the vitrified waste, which are then being produced at Sellafield from the reprocessing of Magnox fuel. This project was led by UK AEA and IGS, the Institute of Geological Sciences, now back to its old name as the British Geological Survey. UK AEA announced an intention to do exploratory drilling at sites in Scotland, Cornwall, Wales and Northumberland. Immediately there was very strong resistance and slow progress, with a suspicion that if a good site were found, a repository would soon follow. And this cartoon gives you some idea, courtesy of SCRAM, the Scottish Campaign to Resist the Atomic Menace. You see the notice at the front there, and you see that what they say is, well, yes, it's a test drilling site, but soon the real notice will appear. It's a disposal site, so we don't trust you, Dales. So this was the time of the leaks at Sellafield and the Thorpe Inquiry of 1977, and there was a tangible rise in feeling against nuclear power. Eventually, in July 1979, DOE published a list of 11 identified areas as suitable for investigation, adding that 10 years research was needed. And then later that year, in September, a DOE report states the disposal of high-level waste should be pursued vigorously. So the places listed here are indicated by the red dots. For investigatory drilling was submitted for most of them, and only Outler Break up here in the north of Scotland, not far from Dounreay, was approved. Most of the others went to public inquiry. 1981, the Government Advisory Committee, ROMAC, expressed concern over the slow rate of progress, while also pointing out that high-level waste would need to be stored on the surface for 50 years before disposal to allow the decay heat to fall. Seizing on this, in December 81, DOE announced abandonment of the high-level waste program on the advice of ROMAC. And the next year it published a new white paper which stated that high-level waste is not an immediate problem. So in 2 years, the issue had gone from one that should be pursued vigorously to one that was not an immediate problem. And that's the first in a series of failures of radioactive waste management policy, an obvious snake. Billingham and the 4 sites was the next one. By 1982, sea dumping had been outlawed, and there was a belief that DRIG, now low-level waste repository, would soon be full. There was a hope that intermediate level waste would be less controversial than high-level waste. So the aim was to find suitable sites for low-level waste and short-lived intermediate level waste. And the job was given to the recently formed Nuclear Industry Radioactive Waste Management Executive, later incorporated as UK NIREX Limited. So, Billingham was announced in 1983. This was an ex-anhydrite mine owned by ICI. It was proposed that it should be used for long-lived intermediate level waste, but immediately there was widespread opposition in Billingham, led by Cleveland County Council and BAND. That's Billingham against nuclear dumping. A public meeting was held with Secretary of State William Waldegrave, now Lord Waldegrave, ended in disorder. ICI withdrew the offer of Billingham in early 1984, saying it was not in the company's best interests. NIREX had no powers of compulsory purchase, so that was the end of the matter. So then we went on to the shallow sites, popularly called in the business the 4-site saga. There were 4 of them. Elstow Beds was announced 1983, a military storage depot, earmarked for low-level waste and short-lived waste. Then 3 further sites were added in 1986, Billingham, Fulbeck and Bradwell. There followed a mass protest against nuclear dumping outside the Department of Environment offices in London. Department of Energy offices in London. The Chernobyl disaster followed soon after, that didn't help. And then in the face of direct action, sabotage, police protections, court injunctions, some site investigations were performed in autumn 1986 under a special development order, in other words, circumventing local opposition. At the same time, a House of Commons Environment Committee, it was the Rossi Committee, produced the Rossi report in 1986, recommending that IOW was to go deep rather than shallow, and that further undermined the programme. And then come the spring of 1987, NIREX was still battling, but there was a general election looming, 11th of June. There was a Conservative government in power and the prospect of a reduced majority. All 4 shallow sites were in Conservative constituencies. On May the 1st, 1987, the 4 remaining sites were abandoned. The Secretary of State, now Nicholas Ridley, said he'd been advised by NIREX that low-level waste could go to a deep repository at marginal cost. So that was it. Another snake. We move on to the next ladder. Sellafield and Dounreay. So that was the end of the 4-site saga. And now all waste that couldn't go to low-level waste repository was to go deep. Making a fresh start in November 1987, NIREX published a consultation document, The Way Forward it was called, explaining its proposed approach and calling for comments. And The Way Forward promised to promote public understanding of the issues involved and to stimulate comment, which will assist NIREX in developing acceptable proposals. There then followed a secret 3-stage siting process, regional evaluation, site selection, site confirmation, in which over 500 sites were screened down to 11. Dounreay was on the list, but Sellafield was not. It was added later by the NIREX board. And then in 1989, the NIREX board decided to focus on Sellafield and Dounreay because of the socio-political support there. The other sites remained secret. 2 boreholes were drilled at each site. And then in 1992, the NIREX board decided to put all its effort into Sellafield, driven by the need to cut costs of site investigations, prospective transport costs. 60% of the waste is already at Sellafield. There was little to distinguish between the 2 on technical grounds. So essentially, the NIREX board sidestepped the site selection process and simply said, no, it's going to be here. So there then followed an extensive site investigation close to the Sellafield site. It's called the Longland Farm site, and because it was on Longland's farm, and the repository was planned to open in 2005, and the first drilling results were obtained in 1992. And finally, there were about 30 boreholes, all at about £5 million each. Most went down to about 600 meters, but a couple went down to 1,000 meters. In total, 25 kilometers of core was extracted, and you can actually see 4 of the drilling pads here. There are 3 in the foreground surrounding the farm, and 1 further back on the way in the middle distance. This is probably the most intensely characterized rock in mainland Britain. Finally, in 1993, NIREX decided to apply for a rock characterization facility, an RCF, an underground laboratory, sort of, to allow the rock to be examined at depth. It was immediately billed as a Trojan horse by those opposing the scheme. The planning application was refused by Cumbria County Council in December '94. NIREX appealed, and the issue went to public inquiry, and this was held at Cleator from September '95 to February '96. And the picture shows Friends of the Earth Trojan horse outside the Cleator office. And Friends of the Earth are quite technically savvy, so you can see they've got their trefoil the right way up there. Good for them. So after working for a year, the inquiry inspector finally refused the appeal in March '97, saying that the site selection process singularly failed to impress. Well, no big surprise there, I think. Secondly, that there was too much uncertainty. And thirdly, he was concerned about disturbance to the local badgers and the traffic and so on. And then this was confirmed by Secretary of State John Selwyn Gummer, a letter of the 17th of March 1997, the same day that the 1997 general election was announced. What a coincidence. Overlooking the site selection point, the NIREX board responded that the existence of uncertainty was the very reason that the RCF was needed. And as for the badgers and the traffic, these matters had already been approved by the relevant authority, or relevant agency, the highways agency and so on. Nevertheless, NIREX decided it would not appeal. And over the next 3 years, NIREX staff numbers went down from 300 to around 60. Another snake. Well, a new Labour government came in 1997. Brave new world. The Labour government didn't accept any need for haste and called for a period of reflection, maybe wanting to let the heat go out of the situation before they pick it up. Malcolm Wicks had no doubts on the matter. He said this was his view. It was a national disgrace. Anyhow, a substantive report, substantive response to the 1997 public inquiry finally appeared 4 years later in September 2001 with the DEFRA Managing Radioactive Waste Safely consultation. Michael Meacher, no friend of nuclear power, now the Secretary of State. The new white paper called for consultation about the consultation to end 2002, a research and public debate on options 2003 to 4, further consultation on the proposed option 2005, announcement on the chosen option seeking views on how this was to be implemented 2006, legislation if needed in 2007, by which time Michael Meach will be safely out of the job. Anyhow, to steer all this, a new committee, CORAM, was established and came up with a long list of options. Here they are. So, storage, yes. Near surface disposal, deep disposal, phase deep disposal, direct injection of liquid waste. Not sure what that means. Disposal at sea, subsea disposal, disposal in ice sheets, disposal in subduction zones, disposal in space, dilute and disperse, partitioning and transmutation, burning in reactors. Well, actually that's the same as partitioning and transmutation. Incineration, well, people do that already, but that's a volume reduction technique. Melting of metals, that's another volume reduction technique. Anyhow, after 3 years of work in 2006, Coram finally recommended what everybody in the business knew already, that geological disposal is the only runner in this marathon. Coram recommended that it be implemented as soon as practicable. UK Nyrex Limited was dissolved and subsumed into the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority in 2007, only to re-emerge as a separate company, Radioactive Waste Management Limited, a year later. So essentially they'd abolished UK Nyrex and then reinvented it as RWM. So then we have a new white paper in 2008, Managing Radioactive Waste Safely. And this envisaged engagement with volunteer communities who would receive unspecified benefits eventually. 2 local communities came forward, the adjacent boroughs of Copeland and Allerdale, both close to Sellafield. And after the initial talks with RWM, both wished to continue the interaction. But this was overruled by Cumbria County Council, which was the planning authority, and that happened in January 2013. And after the ruling, I saw a TV interview with a councillor who'd been part of the opposition. And he was asked by the TV chap, well, what did it mean? Well, he said, this means there won't be any radioactive waste coming to Cumbria. Well, I mean, was he ignorant or was he being disingenuous? I don't know, because it's common knowledge that most of the waste is there already. So I'll have to give it another snake, I'm sorry. Whatever. This phenomenon where a contentious facility is accepted by the local community but rejected by the planning authority is not new. We see the same in arguments over local bypasses where the town wants it but the county doesn't. In the rad waste field, it's already happened in Switzerland at Bellenberg and in the USA at Yucca Mountain. So we come to another policy matter. This is our last one, you'll be pleased to know. This is the policy currently in force. The white paper was published in June 2014, implementing geological disposal. The new policy endorsed the voluntarist approach with 3 main differences. There was to be more upfront information on geology, socio-economic factors, government investment. Also an upfront list of desirable attributes of a suitable site, the rock types and the structure, groundwater, natural resources, processes and so on. An over-prescriptive approach was to be avoided. And thirdly, designation from the outset as a nationally significant infrastructure project in the same way as HS2 or the Heathrow third runway, and therefore not subject to local planning consent. This is to avoid the local versus regional squabble we saw the last time around. And this was in 2014. It envisaged an initial 2-year stage for geological screening and planning, and then 50 to 20 years community engagement, site investigations, detailed design, with community benefits of £1 million per annum, rising to £2.5 million per annum. And there was to be a 100+ years construction and operation phase, promising good local jobs and further investment. And in providing the upfront information into the kind of geology they were looking for, RWM divided the country into 13 geological regions. Scotland's not shown because this is now a devolved matter, so Scotland has its own policy. Comparing this slide with the traditional geological map of the UK, I guess it's reasonable to have Wales as a separate entity, with England and Wales showing the southwest to northeast alignment of the various rock exposures. But coming closer to home of some of our Pugwash Executive Committee members, this is the Bristol and Gloucester region, encompassing Bath. And now accompanying these sub-regions are short talks by RWM staff, which tell you about the geology of the region. And so you have a little treat where you listen to Rob McClatherty of RWM doing his weatherman impersonation, and he's going to tell you all about it, if it works.
This is the Bristol and Gloucester region, and the area bounded by the red line is the subregion that extends from the Forest of Dean in the northwest to Weston-super-Mare and Shepton-Mallet in the south, with an eastern boundary running north from Frome to Dursley. Our work shows that we may find a suitable geological setting for a geological disposal facility, or GDF, in a small part of this subregion, but the potential rock may not be present in suitably shaped or sized volumes. Rock can be seen at the surface in some of the subregion, such as the Forest of Dean, the Avon and Cheddar Gorges, the Mendips, and in quarries. Combined with some deep boreholes and geophysical investigations, this gives us an understanding of the rock's presence and their distribution. There are volcanic lavas and similar strong rocks between Wells and Frome, and to the north of Frome, in which we may be able to site a GDF. These rocks may not be present in suitably shaped or sized volumes, and we would need to do more work to find out whether these rocks have suitable properties and thicknesses. There are also clay-rich rock layers to the south of Bristol around Weston-super-Mare, and between Wells and Frome, in which we may be able to site a GDF. We would need to do more work to find out whether these rocks have suitable properties and thicknesses. Even where individual clay-rich rock layers are found not to be thick enough to host the GDF, they may support the siting of a facility in deeper rocks, as they could act as a barrier to groundwater flow from depth. This is important because the movement of groundwater is one of the ways in which radioactive material could be carried back to the surface. Some of the subregion has been mined for coal resources down to depths below 100 metres. In the Forest of Dean, around Bristol and Midsummer Norton, and iron ore to depths of below 100 metres, also in the Forest of Dean. In these areas, the mining is likely to have affected the way water moves through the rock. Also, possible exploration in the future in these areas means that it is more likely that future generations will disturb a facility. Parts of the Forest of Dean are also coal authority licence areas, allowing companies to explore for coal. This exploration is currently at an early stage, and it's not known if coal is present in sufficient quality and quantity to be exploited commercially. RWM will continue to monitor how this exploration programme progresses. In the southwest corner of the subregion, petroleum exploration and development licenses have been issued, which allow companies to explore for oil and gas. This exploration is also currently at an early stage, and it's not known if oil or gas is present in sufficient volumes to be exploited commercially. RWM will continue to monitor how this exploration programme progresses. There are thermal springs in Bristol and Bath, which indicate that groundwater is moving rapidly from depth to the surface in these areas. This would need to be considered in the siting of the GDF in this subregion.
Okay, oh, no, we don't want that. I want to go to the next one. Okay, so that gives you some idea of what RWM are doing in terms of looking around the country, looking at the kind of geologies that they need, and looking for volunteer communities to step forward. So what we've seen in terms of lessons learned is a 70-year saga of repeated failure to adequately address the issue of the UK's nuclear waste. Other countries have managed to get their act together and have been quietly getting on with it. Finland and Sweden are notable, with disposal development programs stretching back to the 1980s. France and Switzerland are also making good progress. What this history demonstrates is that in searching for a site, social factors are probably much more important than technical ones. The need there for constructive local engagement. This long-term failure of the UK's disposal policy reflects society's unease about all things nuclear, and in my view, throws doubt on any future programme of nuclear power. So will it work this time? Well, it's probably too early to say, I think. The about 2-year consultation period has now stretched to 6 years. The formation of the first local working group in Copeland was announced a month ago. So they are making some progress. There'll be a lot to talk about. As a result of the investigations in the 1990s, a lot is known about the deep geology of the area. But so far as facility design and location is concerned, it will need to be a completely fresh start. Because, for one thing, in the 1990s, the disposal of high-level waste, and you remember that takes up most of the footprint, wasn't considered. This was all for the non-heat generating waste. But for me, the most encouraging thing is that the government at last does seem to recognise the significance of the task and is prepared to be patient and keep on trying. So does it matter? Well, this history of repeated failure is a national embarrassment, a national disgrace, as Malcolm Wicks said. And it's also a waste of taxpayers' money, our money. For these reasons alone, we should want to do better. But there are two much more important reasons for wanting to finally resolve this knotty problem. First, we're not talking about some putative waste that might exist in the future. This is real radioactive waste that exists now. Most of it's stored at Sellafield, but as we've seen, there are dozens of other places up and down the country where it's held. So who created this waste? Well, we did. One way or another, we all have benefited from it. And that might be from the electricity generated from cancer treatments, and even some will argue, from the security we've enjoyed from the UK's nuclear deterrent. For that reason, it's our moral duty for us to deal with these wastes. Passing on the burden to future generations will be shirking our responsibility. Second, man-made climate change poses an existential threat to human society. Nuclear power could be an important tool in fighting this threat by providing a reliable and low-carbon source of electricity. But this is unlikely to happen, in my view, should not happen, unless first society as a whole is willing to acknowledge that deep disposal of radioactive waste is an acceptable solution for the waste that it creates. And second, unless an actual community somewhere in the country is willing to embrace such a geological disposal facility. So I think what I would do is ask you to endorse and support, whenever you can, RWM in its efforts to resolve an issue that's dogged this country for decades. Engagement with the communities is what they need, and engagement with communities is to be encouraged. Any community that does host a deep disposal facility will provide an invaluable service to this and future generations. And rightly, this service will be well rewarded in terms of infrastructure improvements and well-paid jobs. So finally, I would say, spread the word. I'm happy to answer any questions if you like. Over to you, Andrew.
Can you take your slides down?
Oh, right, I have to take the slides, do I? Is that what we do? Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
right.
Thank you very, very much, Ian. That was really fascinating and comprehensive without being the least bit confusing. Andrew, would you be ready to take over? So can I invite people to address themselves to you in whichever form you like, if they would like to ask questions?
Okay, great. Right, thank you. I previously posted asking people to submit questions into the chat box for Ian to select. Unless Ian, you'd prefer for people to put up their hand.
Well, I've just seen Ian put his hand up. Ian, if you want to ask a question, go for it.
Well, it was more an observation, really. I mean, you talked about nuclear power making a big, well, a potential contribution to our cuts in CO2 emissions. I keep hearing this, and I do wonder, because at present, I mean, electricity generation accounts for about 30% of our CO2 emissions, and nuclear contributes at best 20% of our electricity. So we're looking at like a 6% cut in CO2 emissions there, even assuming that nuclear power doesn't have a CO2 footprint, which it does. I mean, it's highly debatable how much, or we can carry on all day debating the footprint of it. But say at best, so we're in the realms of, you know, being able to cut the same amount of CO2 by loft insulation. I mean, how big a cut is nuclear power ever going to provide to our CO2 emissions? It's certainly not going to be cost effective. I mean, I appreciate that we're, you know, with the increasing electrification of transport and whatnot, we're going to need more electricity. But I would seriously question how much of a contribution nuclear power can actually provide. And that's even before we start taking into account the timescales involved and the vast amounts of money. So,
well, where to start, Ian? I mean, my immediate response is the one you've already mentioned, which is that if we're going to deal with climate change there, we're going to have to increasingly electrify. I mean, they're already talking about twice as much electricity generation as we currently have. I think it's going to be more than that. But anyhow, where's that electricity going to come from? Well, some will be renewable for certain. But the problem with the you know about renewables as well as I do, it's intermittent. So we're going to need some intensive sources of energy. I mean, I liken it to the Industrial Revolution in a way. You know, we went away from wind power because steam power was so much more efficient and effective. And now we've moved back to these renewable resources. But in the end, the intensity is not so great. And all the evidence is that we're becoming more and more an urban society. People are moving more and more to the cities. Cities getting ever bigger. And you know, that seems to me that's counterintuitive. But renewable resources, which are spread all over the place, are going to help in that respect. So that's just, I mean, we could argue this all day. No. And I'd be happy to. But I do think nuclear power has a real role to play. If only for the fact that with the AGRs disappearing in the next decade or so, you're not going to be able to, well, you might be able to replace them with lots and lots of windmills and solar power, but I doubt it.
Yeah, I mean, I can see where you're coming from, but I still think that, you know, like energy storage, I mean, there's a whole potential for biogas. Now, by that, I don't mean North American forests being, you know, or biofuels, we say. I don't mean North American forests being burnt in dracs. I mean, things like anaerobic digestion of sewage, creating CO2 neutral methane, if you like. There's a whole gamut of things like that we can use. Battery technology, yes, all right, maybe small scale, maybe not at the moment. I have no faith in it myself.
All that stuff is in the noise, Ian. You know, biodigesters. If you're gonna have storage, you're gonna have to have something on a pretty big scale. We are an industrial society when all said and done.
Well, I mean, this is the tough thing as well. I think I would hesitate to say deindustrialization, but the whole thing about electrifying the transport system. I mean, how long has the human race had personal powered transport? Not very long. We built empires without it, and it's become essential, but it could equally become less essential. I mean, we're going off topic here slightly, but yeah.
We're completely different. You're looking for a different kind of society. But okay,
slowly changing
society. If anyone else has got any questions?
Yeah, cool.
Just had a question did come in by email, which I've posted in the chat box. I think for now it's best if people put questions in the chat box because I turned off everyone's video for data management reasons.
Ah, right, okay.
Well, I'm not opposed to people showing their faces. It's just turn them off before. So that's two questions come in by chat.
So does the presenter agree that it is ecologically and morally irresponsible to go ahead and build new nuclear power plants when there's no agreed technical method or route location with which to dispose of the legacy radioactive waste already created in the UK? Well, I don't agree with you that there's no agreed technical method. I think there is an agreed technical method. Other countries are getting on with it. What's at issue is where. So the how, I think, has been solved. The where is a different matter. And there are, for instance, Copeland has come forward now with a willingness to engage with RWM on siting of a repository. We'll see whether anyone else is interested. Let's give them some time to do it. But I don't think I'd go so far as to condemn the present moves yet. Okay.
There's a question from William Mora in the chat.
Do you want to read out the question?
Sure. Many nations are decommissioning the nuclear power stations. Fukushima, latest news of contaminated cooling water, potential discharge into the sea is terribly depressing. I do believe the nuclear power is a key factor in the electric grid sources of the future. The question is, when is it likely to have a proven deep storage geological disposal? In the range of next 10 years or closer to next 50 years?
Well, okay, well, there's one already existing. There's one I didn't mention, which is the so-called WIP facility in the USA. And this is used for defense wastes. And I can't remember the date, I can't remember the depth, but it's in New Mexico, not far from Albuquerque. And it's in bedded salts. And these are evaporite formations where you dig out the salt, put the waste in, and then the salt collapses in on it. And that's been in operation, well, at least for 20 years. And then the other thing is, of course, do you actually know where your mercury waste and cadmium waste go? The truth is, not many people know this, as Michael Caine would say, but they're actually put into salt mines in Cheshire. And I haven't ever examined the safety of the salt mines, I have to say, so I wouldn't want to say whether it's a good thing or not. But these are considerably lesser depth than would be proposed for a radioactive waste management facility. So, you know, these facilities exist already. And so far as the ones for high level waste are concerned, well, Finland and Sweden are well on with it. I think, I can't remember the exact position in Finland. I think they've been given approval to go ahead with construction. And the Swedes are agonizing over the safety case still, I believe. So these things do exist.
Okay.
Not in the UK.
We don't have any more questions lined up. Maybe we should wait a minute or two and see if any more come in.
Can you give us back the pictures?
What, you want to share the screen again?
Yes.
Okay. I can't remember how to do it.
And
Okay.
we have one question coming from Francis Hill. Should I read that, Ian?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Is the vitrified high-level waste retrievable? Many wastes from the past have become resources used later.
Well, the whole point of disposal is that you don't retrieve. The French have put retrievability into their law. So their waste management agency, called ANDRA, are governed by a law, I think of 1974 or something. And one of the requirements on them is to provide retrievability. And I think the way they are addressing this is that essentially when the facility is in operation, so you're still putting waste down there, then all these wastes can be retrieved quite easily. You know, essentially you just run the operation in reverse, so to speak. Once you start backfilling, putting rock inside these excavations and filling it back to the surface, well, then it becomes progressively more and more difficult to retrieve. So I think they kind of have levels of retrievability. But given that these facilities are likely to operate for decades, certainly, maybe 100 years or more, there shouldn't really be an issue on that. As an old nuclear oppo of mine used to say, if you want more of this stuff, we know how to make it. so I don't really think, particularly with vitrified waste, that it's not really retrievable. Even as a vitrified waste, it'd be quite difficult to retrieve this stuff out of the glass. So you probably wouldn't want to even try. And in a way, I mean, that's part of the point, isn't it? The reason this stuff is put in glass is to immobilize it and prevent it coming out, to make it difficult for the waste for the radionuclides to escape. So in a way, you don't really want retrievability in that sense.
There was a follow-up comment there from Francis, which is, yeah, on the same, in tune with what you were saying. Retrievability is a double-edged sword, value for future resource, but also a security risk stored up for unknown numbers of future generations.
Yeah, so in the UK, generally, we have a skewed retrievability. There was a brief flirtation with it in the early 90s, but it's really been put to one side in the UK.
I've got a question.
Hello, John.
Hello. My question is that with the timescales for this being measured in hundreds of years, possibly even thousands of years, it looks like the risks of global warming are such that sea level rises could well overwhelm any facility that's based in lowland country, like behind you on the screen here, the Severn Valley, or even, of course, at the sites in Cumberland. And in fact, the sites where it's currently stored there at Sellafield are only a few tens, if not 100 foot above sea level. So that's probably a greater threat than all these other ones.
Yeah, in fact, if you go down to 500 meters, you're virtually certain to hit water anyway. So all these facilities are saturated. It's pretty, the one that's in, one of the reasons I didn't mention the WIT facility in New Mexico is it's quite an unusual facility, this bedded salt. We have it in Cheshire, but at a much lesser depth. Generally speaking, any of these facilities are going to be saturated anyway, so you'd probably be pumping water out to keep them dry, and then once you retreat and move away, then the water will flow back in. So I mean, that's why groundwater is the most important vector for radionuclide movement. As for surface facilities, well, yes, the low-level waste repository near Sellafield is on the coast. I think it's about 10 meters elevation. The way the safety case is framed is that you have what's called an institutional control period, where people look after the site and maintain it and manage it and keep it safe and do whatever's necessary to repair it. And that normally lasts for 300 years. That's assumed to last for 300 years. That is as much as the regulator will allow you. And the arguments behind that rest on the continuation of organisations like the Royal Society or the papacy, which have endured for long periods, and people have maintained the records and so on over these periods. So during this period of 300 years, if the sea level were to start impinging on the waste, then you would take some kind of measures to prevent it or to remediate. If once you get to 300 years, then most of these wastes will have decayed down to a level where they're no longer of really great significant import for human health. There are a few long-lived radionuclides in there, it's inevitable. But the level of these is controlled very, very severely. And it's those levels which dictate essentially the level of activity that can be put in this facility. So for instance, beyond 300 years, you make assumptions about erosion, breaking down breaking through to the facility, to the low-level waste repository, and effectively the waste package is being spread out on a beach, and nobody having any idea of what these packages are, or what they're for, or what they contain. And then you model how people might interact with these packages, and try to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the regulator that it is safe enough anyway. So that's the way you do it. Yes. So climate change has to be taken into account in the safety cases for all these facilities, whether they're deep or whether they're shallow. And it's actually, sometimes it is the limiting feature. In a few cases, it can make it safer, believe it or not, because the seawater dilutes the radionuclides. But generally speaking, you then focus on areas where those radionuclides are not being diluted. So you look at areas where maybe the sea level goes down. There's all kinds of scenarios.
My point was actually slightly different from the one you...
Sorry, John.
That rising sea levels by the end of this century are likely to overwhelm sites such as Sellafield.
Yeah, well, if that's the case, I don't know whether it is. If that's the case, then the operators at that site will be duty bound to take steps to make sure that the facilities are safe. You know, and I don't know what they do, but it would still be within human control. It would still be within institutional control, and you'd have to do whatever it took to make sure that safety was maintained, regardless of what was happening with sea level.
A humorous and slightly flippant answer to that would be hire King Canute.
Yeah, of course, I know. But you know, there are things you can do, and it's not as though you won't have any warning. You'll know well in advance what was happening and be able to take measures in time.
Okay, we have another question from Francis Hill. Is there a financial resource for carrying forward care, etc., of these materials appropriate for 300 years at the increasingly fast rate of political/industrial and social change?
Thank you, Francis, for that question. That's a brilliant question. And in fact, I've given lots of talks on radioactive waste management. I've often done it for the IAA. And talking to people in countries which are setting up their radioactive waste management infrastructure, one of the things I always emphasize is that one of the key issues is to make sure the money's there. Because if the money's not there, then you're never going to be able to do anything. So if you've got a nuclear power station, you're making money during the periods of its operation, and you should be putting some of that money aside. In fact, it's a regulatory requirement in the UK for that to be done. Putting money aside to pay for decommissioning and to pay for waste disposal. And one of the big problems is theft, actually, not so much in this country, but in other countries, people see this big pot of money and they can't keep their sticky hands off it. So this does actually happen. The problem is with the waste, most of the legacy waste we've got here, you'll recall that the nuclear industry was sold off by Mrs. Thatcher, but a large part of it retained in public ownership. All the magnet stations were retained, and that was because the investments have been sold off by the Thatcher government. In fact, CGB had made investments in plant to act as an investment vehicle, a means of making money to pay for decommissioning. Probably wasn't enough, but the idea at least was there. So they built Drig, in fact, this big coal-fired station in the Midlands. It's not Drig, Drax in the Midlands, as a means of generating money to pay for decommissioning. And then when privatisation came, Drax was sold off. This money was liquidated, so that was lost. And then it's a long saga of where the money's gone to, but in the end, it's the taxpayer that's been left with the burden of paying for these legacy wastes in the UK. For the waste that are owned by British Energy and EDF now, there is a fund there which they've been paying into for I don't know how many years to pay for waste management and for decommissioning, and that's overseen by the regulatory body. Does that help, Francis? Can't hear.
I can hear and I can reply. We can't surely leave the taxpayer of 10 generations forward responsible for managing the fact that the money that was put in the bank for this, the investments that were put in have disappeared, disintegrated, you know, evaporated.
No,
What's the security on all this?
you're absolutely right. And that's why we need to do it now. That's why it needs to be done now, because we don't want to give this burden, pass this burden on to future generations. This is the whole point of intergenerational equity. That it's our responsibility to deal with these wastes, not pass it on to some future generation. We've got the money, we can do it. Well, we had the money before COVID. Whether we've got the money in the future, I don't know. We'll see. No, it was a joke.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, I can't see any more questions. So there's one from William Mora. How much is the money?
I've forgotten the exact, I forgot what figure has been put on it. You can find it easily enough, but it represents a few percent of the income, a few percent of your electricity bill. If you think of it in that way, that's the way I usually think of it. So if the money, if a few percent of the income from selling electricity were to be put to one side, that would build up over the years of operation of a nuclear power station into a sufficient fund to deal with the decommissioning and the waste. So, but I can't actually tell you what the actual figure is. I've forgotten. I used to know.
Okay, well, we don't seem to have any more questions. I think we said the event would be scheduled until 7 o'clock, but if there aren't any more questions, maybe we should bring it to a close. But I mean, I'll leave that to Ian and maybe Peter as chair.
Okay, well, I'm happy to finish now. I think we've had given it a good go.
I don't know if you can hear me because I'm completely blanked out, but if you can, I agree with you, and I think we've given it a good go. I think what has particularly struck me is that the how has been solved. You explained that the how has been solved, and that's very significant. So it is just now a question of where, and at least the government does seem at last, perhaps, fingers crossed, to be approaching the solving the problem of where in a sensible way. Anyway, thank you again, Ian. It's been a really good talk. Good night, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
Andrew.
Thank you.